First of all, I want to say that it is a great honor to be here, and I really appreciate Olaf and all of you extending me a welcome. Even though I started, life in the PDF world as an insider, I'm no longer the same, and so I hope that you'll bear with me as I bring you yet again, an outside perspective on this question of quote PDF 3.0. What's next beyond PDF 2.0, and it is perhaps a controversial perspective, but it's really, I'm really mentioning this to you more as food for thought, again, from this outside perspective, rather than necessarily how the world will or should shake out. It's just a point of view, and again, it's with all humility, given how successful PDF has been as a standard, almost all that work happening after I moved on, perhaps not coincidentally. That's pretty amazing, and so this is in a constructive spirit. So first of all, how many people here have heard of or know the works of Clayton Christensen? Okay, not almost nobody. So he's a professor at Harvard Business School, and he's authored a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. How many people have heard of that term? Okay, a fair amount of you. So he has a theory that is called the Disruptive Innovation Model, and in my 15 minutes I don't have time to explain it to you, but this graph summarizes it. And the idea is that for any given technology that gets onto a sustaining vector of innovation, the progress occurs at a certain rate over time, but eventually kind of surpasses the needs of at least even the high end of the market, and significantly surpasses the needs of the low end of the market. And at that point, once the progress here is sort of addressing that best customer, then a low-end disruptive entrant can come in and take advantage of different sort of price performance characteristics to have a disruptive effect on that market. And this is a repeating phenomenon over and over again in many, many different industries that you can read about in his books. And my thesis is that PDF is sort of here. It's surpassed the need significantly. People who just need to click, make a PDF on their Microsoft Word file and share it with people, and it's in many ways surpassed some of the needs of the high end of the market. And there are still customers out there for whom the needs aren't quite met, which is why there's still work to be done. But that's a low rate of progress vector. And in fact, hearing Leonard say we've got all the customers we need, we've got all the users we need. To me, that's a red flag. Any time you're saying that, that should be, the Fortran guy said that once upon a time, and so did the Lotus Notes guys, and so forth. And so my theory, and again, this is just my personal point of view. It's certainly not the opinion of the IDPF, my organization I work for, or anything else. Is that PDF is past the performance demanded by the vast majority of the market for ad hoc and commercial portable document distribution. I'm not speaking here of the prepress usage and all that kind of stuff. And my belief is that, I'll advance it, 99% of the usage of Acrobat Reader and 99.9% of the PDF documents on the web have nothing to do with the very high-end workflows. And Leonard mentioned, for example, that there's over 10,000 PDF documents digitally signed a month, or tens of thousands. But there's probably tens of millions created a month. And so if you do the percentages, you're saying that those digital signatures are a tiny fraction of a percent. And Adobe does, as Leonard indicated, have data on the usage of Acrobat and Reader. It's been also publicly reported that they have data of spidering PDF documents on the web and statistical data about the PDF documents on the web. So far, they have not chosen to make that data public. And I submit to you that if the data showed that there was a lot of robust usage of the advanced features of Acrobat and of PDF, we'd be more likely to see that data. But in fact, the fact that Apple Preview, the built-in functionality of PDF on the iPad, the iPhone, and Mac, has a very limited set of functionality, should tell you kind of where the bar is being set about what PDF features are used by the vast majority of the market. Again, not the market that most of you are targeting with your commercial solutions focused up at that high end. So from my point of view, the HTML5 EPUB platform applied to portable documents represents a low-end disruptive innovation, in the sense of that curve. But it's still down here. There's only a very few users, like Ibooks, for whom EPUB has become a compelling solution. It's very few right now, but it's on a nonlinear improvement graph. Is my thesis for you. and that the ability to dynamically paginate is key to supporting emerging end screen and accessibility requirements. And Leonard mentioned things like more declarative forms model and declarative 3D. When video is archival ready, that'll be important. But none of those things are really tied intrinsically to a fixed typeset at the factory representation. You still want declarative forms if your digital textbook can adapt to different size screens. You still want declarative 3D, no matter whether the 3D object is rotating around a page that's been laid out once and never changes, or in fact can adapt to user's context. And so it seems to me that tying any of those things to the page-only representation just isn't reasonable, especially in the world where the browser platform is increasingly proliferated and is sort of increasingly universal. And I would submit that when you look at the next version of Adobe InDesign and read the sort of what's new, look for how many times the term PDF appears, and look for how many times the term HTML5 and EPUB appears, and do the math and form your own conclusion. If even Adobe is pushing most of its resources into other areas like the web platform, then that's another hint. So we already have HTML5 in the browser, the universal player, and we really can see that Flash and Silverlight you can say now that they are legacy technologies. I'm not sure Adobe would say that, but the fact that today they announced that they're asking vendors anybody building a Flash application that uses the hardware accelerated features in the newest Flash player to pay them an 8% tax, sort of tells you that they're sort of milking the install base. They're no longer focused on getting market share. They're focused on extracting value from the locked-in users. In the meantime, we have Windows 8, all entirely based on HTML and JavaScript as the UI layer in the Metro applications for both desktop Windows 8 and mobile. Things like WebOS that are built around the web. Facebook, whose application model is building widgets on the web. And increasingly, mobile applications are web apps that have been wrapped in a native application. So all of the logic of the application is in JavaScript and in the HTML and CSS. And they use frameworks like Phonegap, acquired by Adobe now, as a way to wrap it. So you might say Phonegap is the new Air, in a sense, for the people building leading-edge web apps where they don't want to make a Flash app. They want to use web technologies but make a native app out of it. And they're doing that through technology that's now owned by Adobe. We're here in Day Software's former offices, and how much of that has to do with anything other than the HTML, browser, network, internet ecosystem? Not much. And now in InDesign and the new next generation digital production suite, digital publishing suite, we have this new thing, Liquid Layout, that again is not really announced in detail, but if you Google that term, you'll see some public disclosure from Adobe about some very compelling stuff about page template-based stuff for dynamic, adaptive documents that is really enabling rich documents that aren't tied to only one 3-column representation. And Olaf said that on a computer screen, PDF might be optimal, but I still think that if you have a 4-column PDF document even on a large screen, and you need a big type, it may not be optimal to have to pan and zoom around that document. And despite user interface affordances, it's better if you can actually expand and not have to pan and zoom. So. And then we have to recognize the reality that paper centricity is decreasing. In fact, corporate usage of paper peaked in 1999 and has been dropping substantially since around the globe in most places in the developed world. So we've got declining usage of paper. We've got XML-based workflows proliferating, and again, we've already got the sort of early beachhead. The first pin of the bowling alley in the ebook market, which has essentially abandoned PDF for EPUB. From my point of view, there's a couple or three Achilles heels of PDF. The HTML5 EPUB ecosystem can embrace paginated content, and I showed the fixed layout stuff this morning, far more easily than PDF can embrace structured, accessible, end screen content. I think Olaf's idea of layering on CSS into this pre-paginated world is going to be very challenging to pull off because styling stuff that's already been typeset is going to be challenging. On the other hand, I actually like the idea of the hybrid documents, but in fact, you can see an example of that going the other direction in, unfortunately, a proprietary format, but Apple Ibooks Author, a new tool announced by Apple, creates proprietary files. Some of the content looks an awful lot like EPUB, but in addition, there's some little extra stuff there, one of those extra stuff is basically hints that that the reflow version that you see if you have your iPad in a portrait mode, when you go to landscape mode, it is a fixed representation. But it's not a duplication of the content. Instead, there's some sort of hints about where the line breaks should go or where the glyphs should be laid out, so that the structured semantic stuff, the paragraphs, the sections, etc., get augmented with the hints about the line breaking, and that creates a hybrid that can give you a high fidelity WYSIWYG view, but the content is still in a structured form. And I think that going hybrid from reflow down to fixed is going to be an inherently easier job than going the other way. And luckily, I think there's some prior art on that Apple stuff, so we'll keep our fingers crossed. Doesn't impact. And I think the PDF ecosystem just can't keep up with the nonlinear progress. I'm making up these numbers, so I'll submit right now that they're not correct, but I think they're roughly correct. That ActionScript 3, when it first came out, was 10 times faster than the browser JavaScript at that time because of a JIT compiler in ActionScript 3 that was not there in the browser stack. It was in Java, something similar in Java. So we had ActionScript 3 that was much, much faster at just raw computation than browser. Meanwhile, now it's 100 times slower than things like Chrome V8, which is actually becoming the fastest engine for server-based things. Node.js, a JavaScript running on the server, powered by the same Google V8 engine used in the browser, is becoming a rapidly adopted, the fastest growing server technology now, partly because of its awesome performance. So we've gotten, now I'm not saying ActionScript 3 hasn't gotten faster, but it's only gotten faster on that very incremental pace, whereas the browser is still competing. And you've got a competitive situation. If Google announced tomorrow or Apple announced tomorrow that you'd have to pay 8% to use hardware acceleration in their browser, people would say, forget it, I'm going to deploy to a different browser. That arms race goes on with a multi-vendor world, which makes it very difficult to sort of be closed. And then you've got the browser JavaScript sandbox getting far more scrutiny, and it doesn't represent incremental risk. The same platforms where Leonard said, well, we can't get JavaScript on there, are ones that already have JavaScript in the browser engine, and it is turned on. And 99-point-something percentage of the users have JavaScript turned on because you can't even book a ticket on Expedia without it. And so JavaScript is both enabled essentially for all users, and gets the security attention to make breaches at a minimum. And again, EPUB as the secure packaging of HTML5 just inherits that whole browser stack and its security sandbox and regime. And then last but not least, as I mentioned this morning, perhaps somewhat controversially, but I think correctly, there's a perception around the world, as I travel anyway, that the folks I talk to, that PDF still really belongs to Adobe. And Forms is an example of where XFA got into ISO 32000, but let's face it, XFA was and is a proprietary Adobe-only technology. And so that is sort of the sort of mark of whatever. I won't say red badge of courage, the scarlet letter, the scarlet A, indicating that really ISO 32000 wasn't just a neutral technology. So one possible future, given all that, and again, I'm going to stipulate here that this is not necessarily the future that will happen, or even the future I'd like to see happen, but I submit to you that wouldn't it be interesting if we never got to a PDF 3.0, just as there was never a PostScript 4. PostScript 3 was done in 1997. It's been a long time, guys. Why didn't we get there? Not because PostScript was a failure. I like to think it was, and I helped work on PostScript for many years, but because PDF was able to take on those workflow needs in a graceful way. PostScript lives on. I mean, there is still PostScript out there and PostScript solutions, but the active market, the growth opportunity, the opportunity where we say we don't have all the users we need already, but we want to go get new users and make new money, moved on. So if we're going to do that, though, I think it would be necessary and helpful and profitable for key members of the PDF ecosystem, i.e. you guys, to help bring the functionality to EPUB sooner rather than later. Now, it might get there anyway, even if all of you guys decide you want to keep kind of working away at PDF only, just as a lot of the PostScript guys, frankly, stayed with PostScript. Some of them didn't. Some of them moved to PDF, but some of them stayed. But things like digital signatures, advanced OCR, attachments and collections, engineering 3D, redaction, even ultimately potentially prepress functionality, because we have people like Canon and others looking at SVG printing, high-end stuff there, and because there is a lossless representation of PDF page contents in SVG, I think this one is going to take a long time. It may not ever happen, but I think the other stuff is a given, given the start we've already got on HTML5 based portable documents and the advantages of the browser ecosystem. So I submit that leveraging the rising tide of the open web standards and the browser evolution is a train that exists. And I think that you guys, some of you, and your companies could make a lot of money helping with it. And so I personally want to reach out to you and say, if there's any way collaborating with either the IDPF on development of the standards and related deliverables, or with our members, who are many of them actively seeking solutions in these areas, I'm more than happy to make the connections. And in fact, maybe instead of saying we never get to a PDF 3.0, maybe we never get to an EPUB 4, and PDF 3 becomes based on this collection of web standards and really the portable document format of the future, converges both the PDF info set and the EPUB browser and open web-based serialization in a constructive way. And I would be equally happy, if not happier, to have it be that we never get to an EPUB 4 because PDF 3 is EPUB 4. And in fact, there's a story. I'm under NDA, so I can't talk about it really. But there's a story that once upon a time, what became EPUB might have been referred to as a PDF++ within Adobe. So it's not altogether, it's not altogether crazy to say that could be a feature. So that's the end, and I hope that leads to a few questions, and maybe we should all come up and have joint questions. Or if there are any questions that are just for me, how about that? Because then we can have some debating, if there's time permits. How much time do we have?
As long as ask questions.
All right. Fine. All right. Well, ask me questions, but if you want to address them to Leonard or Olaf, or if they want to get into it, we can. So, yeah. Any questions?
Nobody else has argued.
Go ahead. Come on. Come on.
So one of the, it's very interesting, tale, if you will. One of the things that I see as I go around the world and I talk to various international governments about, not so much about EPUB, but about the web, is that because of the web being a, quote, living, HTML5 being a, quote, living standard, no one that I've talked to around the world is willing to even start to consider it as an acceptable standard that they can adopt officially, as they've adopted HTML4 and PDF and even EPUB 2 in some cases. And I'm curious how you see, and you talked this morning about EPUB
Right.
being HTML domesticated, which I do think is a great move in that direction. But you just talk a little bit about how you see those things related, especially given this vision.
Well, so I think it's clear that if EPUB is going to expand its usefulness to a broad range of portable document workflows, that we're going to need an EPUB A. There's no question in my mind. And part of the EPUB A can be to eliminate dependencies on what I would call squishy web standards, and or pin them down. The approach we took in our normative specs for EPUB 3.0, given that many of those CSS3 modules and even HTML5 itself are not in a final state, was to be very clear, particularly on the schema. So we happen to have had the good luck to have Murata Makoto, who created RelaxNG, as a critical lead contributor. He led the global language support subgroup of EPUB 3 and helped develop what we needed to do for vertical writing. But he also helped us get a regimen in place of using RelaxNG. So we have RelaxNG schemas for the main building blocks of EPUB, even in places where the W3C doesn't have a normative schema, like HTML5. And our commitment is, our spec has this normative schema for HTML5. If HTML5 changes, because it's not done yet, our version is still frozen to that schema. We'll do a revision that has a modified schema and deal with the sort of schema evolution and content migration. But we've got at least a process in place for that, and because we've nailed down our 3.0 to a particular instantiation of a schema, it's a little bit less squishy. Whether it will meet the needs of the government of Japan for an officially blessed format, it is debatable. Although I think the demand for an accessible digital publishing format and a demand for a format that's not controlled by a company like Amazon for ebooks is creating a lot of pressure to in fact formally adopt, despite the issues about the web. And also the fact is the web standards are just a fact of life. I mean, in Thailand, they're using smartphones with browsers in the web, and it's not an option to say, well, we're not going to use that stuff. And so therefore, finished or not, baked or not, we're starting to eat the cookies. But it's probably our biggest problem. The biggest upside of EPUB is it's based on HTML5 and the modern web standards, and the biggest downside is that it's based on those things. So that's just the way it is. Other questions? Olaf, you do have any questions? You must.
No, I think.
Too tired? If there's no more questions, we could just finish. There must be one more. Come on. Duff? Come on, you got it. Help me out here. Help me out here.
I'm thinking about somebody else go.
All right. Thank you.
You mentioned that SVG is capable of taking over all PDF functionality. Is this true also for the very high end, like transparency and overprinting stuff?
Well, what I can say is as of PDF 1.7 or something like that, so with that asterisk, that it was as of that time of 2008, 2009. I don't think much has changed, but that's an asterisk. And I can say that Adobe had to make certain extensions to SVG, basically additional stuff in its own namespace that could be sprinkled into an SVG file. I believe some of the issues involved like a few fine points of the transparency model, but also smooth shading wasn't done precisely the same way in SVG, because SVG had gotten standardized long before some of that stuff got into PDF, but also there were just some inconsistencies. So, but I'd be happy to send you the document. I think it should still be available on Adobe Labs, which was the last published version of the Adobe Mars specification, which goes into gory detail on what they call the SVG/FSS fast static subset and subset was wrong. They call it fast static subset, but it's actually fast static sub/superset because they made some extensions. So smart people did the work, including Matthew Hardy was one of them. So on this mapping. So I believe that at that time it was possible to losslessly convert a PDF page to SVG, and then round trip it back and have it stay the same. But
it was mainly things like spot colors, transparency models. There was quite a few things where we basically had to define extensions to SVG to be able to round trip some of the more enhanced capabilities of PDF.
That includes special things like page boxes, etc.
All of those had to be added, or some of that was added outside of, like page boxes were actually added outside of the SVG. They weren't part of it. But the main thing, and to keep in mind, is for better or worse, PDF has 11 different ways to represent color. As the web has one way to represent color. Okay, so you can either, and this sort of goes towards Olaf's comments earlier about simplification. Do we really need all 11 ways? Some people say yes, some say no. Is one enough?
can we just go with Unicode, for example? And for God's sakes, yes. I hope.
Well, actually, there are problems with that.
Right.
There's actually problems with that the SVG committee right now is dealing with.
Correct.
There's actually problems with a pure Unicode-only model that are being addressed by the SVG.
True. And as far as forms are concerned, on the page, my point of view is that the SVG is a layer, if there's SVG there, and any form stuff is done in standard HTML form stuff, and that the current, actually the old, aged Adobe Acroforms technology, doesn't directly translate into the new world of EPUB, but rather EPUB gets all the HTML forms capabilities, which are a superset functionally, but not every document could translate losses. I'm only suggesting that the mapping of the page contents itself, which is just one piece, was done. So, Duff, do you have your question now? We could end with you. Oh, all right, in the back.
Yeah, right now HTML5 does have 3 different technologies inside. Let's say Canvas, description, SVG, and pure HTML. And you were talking about adding a couple of, 3D models and so on, security levels, digital signature, stuff like that. Why do you think you will not end up as PDF is right now in 5 years?
Well, there's a good question about is the HTML stack itself bloated? And I don't think there's any argument that for example, the rationalization of the Canvas API for drawing and the CSS box model and the SVG imaging model could have been done in a nice stacked manner, with the API for drawing at the bottom and the SVG sort of artwork tree in the middle and the CSS formatter on the top and a nice layer there. And instead they're all 3 separate parallel things with MathML yet parallel again. But that's not a problem EPUB EPUB just inherits that from the browser world, and my point of view is the browser world, for better or for worse, is becoming the universal runtime, and it happens to have a somewhat cumbersome, mainly tripartite level of rendering models between SVG, the CSS box model, and its transforms and animations, and the canvas. But they're none of them really related to each other. I mean, and so EPUB wouldn't add anything there, isn't adding anything there now or in the future. In the case of digital signatures, all that is added on top, and that's not about the content expression. That's about what you do to kind of shrink wrap the content, you might say. And so I think that's an orthogonal issue that I think the W3C isn't really ready to address, but could be addressed by IDPF in our sort of packaged version of EPUB without adding any bloat to the web standards or to what we're doing. But we'll see. I mean, it isn't the most elegant stack now, although I do think it's no less elegant than the way various annotations models have been abused to add things like video to PDF over the years, right? I mean, every technology gets accrete stuff. My only point is that the web stack thanks to open source and the multi-vendor competition and a new multi-device world, the web stack is just winning. It's not a value judgment that it's warp-free, because I don't think it is. I mean, it isn't.
Bill, you.
Leonard has listed some of the areas that he thinks PDF should move towards. Does EPUB address any of those areas?
Well, I think EPUB and the HTML stack does, but there's some work to be done. So, for example, video. The video standardization debates and sort of wars between vendors continues, but it's going to settle out in the web world, relatively soon, because it's a critical priority. And so I think when that settles out, that becomes a done deal immediately in the EPUB world with no further work on our part. We normatively reference HTML5 video. The only question is what combinations of codecs become stabilized as standards. Declarative forms. There's the forms model of HTML5 is significantly enhanced over the prior HTML, but it is still somewhat dependent on JavaScript, being in there. There is a technology called XForms that took a more fully declarative approach that I personally had a lot of fondness for, but it never took off anywhere in a serious way. But I would submit that trying to redo a declarative XML-based form language without at least taking into account how far XForms got and what's salvageable, you're doomed to reinvent history unless you learn from it. And I don't think doing that over in the PDF world would do any better. So I'm not sure we can. The reason that XForms didn't take off is that web forms with JavaScript were so prevalent, and I'm not sure that's going to be any different. And in fact, you could argue that's one reason XFA didn't take off, because Acroforms was so prevalent. So if the issue is that the install base won't permit, from an adoption point of view, a brand new declarative technology for forms, then I don't think it's going to change. But certainly we have XForms as a W3C standard, and we have various declarative things for 3D. It seems like right now the web world is converging towards an API-based model for 3D, similar to Canvas, but for 3D. But again, at being hardware accelerated, that can easily lend itself to dealing with different data representations of that 3D, like potentially PRC. And then you've got JavaScript for manipulation of the models already there and already with the APIs. And so it could be that the web world makes those pretty easy problems relative to things like PDF, where you don't know that you can even have JavaScript, and you don't have hardware accelerated web GL as you now are going to have it in all browsers. So the browser, there's no automatic solution to Leonard's problems in this ecosystem, but I should say that there's a path ahead that I think is not horribly thorny path on all those things that he talked about from my perspective. But that's looking with the rosy-colored glasses of someone who's jumped on the open web bandwagon. So take that with that grain of salt. So, all right, last question. If you get to close.
Well, two thoughts. One, you
I think
mentioned a couple of O'Reilly's books, and as you're probably aware, a few days ago O'Reilly announced that for whatever reason, 90% of the ebooks that they distribute are in PDF. And that, in other words, PDF is a great preponderance of the ebooks that people want when they get an O'Reilly ebook.
Yeah.
So that's an observation, and it doesn't prove anything right now. EPUB is nascent, it's fair to say.
Well, they announced, as far as I know, that was of the ones they directly distribute.
I didn't
Yes,
look at
that's
that level.
That's the ones that they directly
Right,
distribute.
and so they didn't denounce the relative sales of direct distribution through versus sales through Amazon Kindle, sales through Barnes & Noble Nook Store, the Kobo Store, et cetera, and those sales are not PDF based, and they come from EPUB-based workflows. So
They are not,
so-
but I believe the situation was a case where users had a choice of formats and they picked one.
Right, but they're the ones who came to O'Reilly potentially in part because they wanted the PDF that they couldn't get from Kobo or Barnes & Noble. So there's some
Okay.
selection questions there.
No, that's a reasonable.
But also we have a group there that is still got printing workflows in mind. I mean, and for those kind of complicated things, EPUB 2, frankly, isn't a great format for a lot of the O'Reilly books. O'Reilly has EPUB 3 generation capabilities, and on the EPUB 3 samples project that I showed earlier, a brief peek at, there's an EPUB 3 version of one of the O'Reilly pieces. What is EPUB 3 generated by O'Reilly in EPUB 3? But the EPUB 2 versions of those things, have sort of minimal layouts. And so if I wanted a technical book from O'Reilly, and it has a lot of code samples and other complicated stuff, I'd be likely to get a PDF because I'm going to look at it on a large screen, and the PDF version is going to have higher fidelity visuals than the EPUB 2 version, which was really not designed to represent complex pages. EPUB 3 is going to be a totally different ballgame,
Okay.
and with liquid layout coming, it's an incredibly different ballgame. So see what happens then.
So we'll
Yes.
watch that space.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So the second question revolves, I suppose, around this. On the matter of perceptions, so as a project leader for ISO 32000, I take a little exception to the idea that the ISO process is a rubber stamp to the Adobe reference. Adobe knows just as well as anybody else that they've lost as many things as they've won in the ISO process, and it's been part of the democratization of the format. And I think that's fine. But leaving that aside, one of the things that clearly has been a tremendous part of the PDF success story has been the stability of the document, the frozenness of a PDF. And the perception, as you say, and I don't say that you're wrong, is that Adobe still in some way owns or manages or operates PDF. Likewise, there's a similar perception about web content, that it's not frozen, that it's fungible, that it can be removed from a server, that there's very little you can trust about a web page that can't change on the fly when you're not looking behind your back.
You can make a PDF out of it, did you?
And that's what people do when they say to themselves, here's a piece of content that needs to be preserved for me. Now, I'd imagine one objection to this sort of observation would be, well, in no time at all, a content provider will be able to put a button on their web page saying, okay, give me this web page as an EPUB. And I suppose that it could generate that EPUB, zip it all up, and deliver it to you. Is that how you would address the concern that
I would go further and say that generated EPUB should have digital signature applied so that there's a shrink wrap around it that is technologically based. Because as we know, in the case of normal PDFs, there's really no technological barrier. You can go in and reach in and get the images, and many of the vendors here.
Perceptions.
Sure.
Perceptions are, this is a marketplace issue. PDF is right now the global electronic document format. We'll probably go ahead and take your suggestion of eating EPUB and turning it into PDF 3, and that would be interesting. But obviously, I'm kidding. As a market perception matter, and your point about Adobe and ISO process is very valid. Likewise, though, there's a tremendous perception out there, and a difficult one to counter, taking an enormous amount of marketing effort to counter the idea that there's something inherently about a web page that it changes. However open you drag your browser window, things will happen.
So let me just
Browsers
cut to the
and so
chase and give you my point of view.
Yeah.
John Warnock's favorite feature in Acrobat for many years was, maybe as far as I know still is, web capture. A feature some of us thought was always kind of weird, like what does it mean to web capture, Expedia.com's homepage? But there's a variety of people who want to create a static version of web content.
Yep.
I'm willing to make a wager with anybody, a small wager, a bottle of schnapps or something, that by Acrobat 12, web capture will, at least optionally, if not by default, make an EPUB, not a PDF, because that'll be a more natural way to statically capture web content, not losslessly convert it, but in fact captured as EPUB. And if they don't, now I'll lose the bet, but somebody else here in this room will probably have a commercial product doing exactly that.
A bet
So
that Acrobat will make an EPUB when it does a web capture?
we'll have that option at least, yeah.
I'll take his money.
I'll take it.
Do I have the best chance of getting the money one way or the other?
So, all right. Well, with that schnapps bet, I guess we'll close. And again, I want to say thank you, and I appreciate you not throwing too many vegetables my way. So, thanks.